Thank you. Yeah, I'm quite happy that I can introduce you a little bit towards the context where martial arts maybe has been seen as in relation to an act of war or counterterrorism, terrorism, or possibly coming from a militarized background. Maybe I'm going to bring the military or a very hyper-violent environment as a next element in a chain that might follow this whole panel. And as such, I would like to, before I start going into this, would like to thank everybody who made it possible and whom I'm representing here. Firstly, one of our sponsors and funders, the Laureen Sport for Good Foundation, my team in Cape Town that I'm representing here, a team of coaches and people that are actually representing and working for our NGO in the field, as well as the teachers of our partnering school that we get a lot of data, information and logistics from in Mitchell's Plain, Cape Town, and the kids that we're working with, because they are quite helpful in learning and relearning different perspectives. And as such, I would like to shape a little bit the context of violence and aggression for you, because it plays a little bit, or quite a significant role, in how we see the pedagogy and the skill set of martial arts as a possible mediator in unlearning or reshaping and relearning a behavior, such as aggression and violence and our relationship to it. South Africa is normally known as a very beautiful but also a very violent country, and I just bring a couple of statistics because in Germany it has been reintroduced as a country in crisis. Currently, for example, we have things such as 85 people being murdered a day. Recent statistics published by the South African Police Service speak of 22,000 murderers a year in the year 2018-2019, published in September of this year. It means we've got a really, really high prevalence of murder, of homicide, but also of attempted homicide, attempted murder, sexual assault, gender-based violence as significant problems and crises. And it actually doesn't know a lot of limits when it comes to victims, because in a country where violence is so prevalent, but somewhat seem for the normatized. It seems to spurt a little bit towards media attention, and that's why I put up this statistic here. If you look at this over the past 10 years, it is quite a stable rate of murder and sexual offenses. If we look at this, even though it comes back to media attention, but it goes a bit up and down, and the real normative values don't really seem to change. And if you look at statistics of the most violent cities, this is the context over which I'm going to speak about is Cape Town. It's now ranked the 11th most dangerous city in the world and as the most dangerous city in Africa. But public perception of Cape Town would probably not be as such as hosting one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. If you look at the crime statistics or the direct homicide and murder statistics of Cape Town, we've got 2,900 murders per year over the last year. That's almost 8 a day of a city with about 4.3 million inhabitants. So it's a hyper-violent environment, a hyper-violent context, and it obviously has a significant effect on how kids grow up in this environment. And their relationship towards norms of aggression and the type of behavioral habitus they develop towards this. So I take a very psychological perspective towards that whole context of violence and how kids grow up within this. And what you see here is a typical gang sign of a gang that exists for 150 years, the so-called numbers gang. And you see kids growing up with this, growing up with certain paraphernalia, growing up with certain habitus, and they have a smile on their face about this, even though it might actually be something representing a hyper-violent experience and a lot of trauma that comes with it. And if you look at some of the statistics, which we could go on and talk about for days or for the whole conference of this, you have a lot of perspectives that almost every single South African citizen has, especially within a school and growing up a development environment for certain scripts of behavior and coping with such repetitive trauma. And if you look at this, a lot of the kids that grow up towards their adolescence, they experience violence as victims, as witnesses, but also as perpetrators. And that includes almost every single learner that grows up in Cape Town. No matter if you go to a private school behind very high walls, but especially if you are growing up in a township, which the majority of the population actually grows up within. And if you look at the statistics, you just find a very, very grim picture that these numbers portray. But again, these numbers are not very, very recent. They are actually quite constant, even before the end of apartheid in 1994. So this year marks a little bit of a landmark, because now the numbers of homicide and murder, 22,000 is similar to 1993 when the country was on the brink of civil war. So with this, and that brings us a little bit now towards the martial arts context and why we see any relevance in martial arts when it comes to such a hyper-violent and almost military-ruled environment, no matter if it's by state authority or by gang street authority, if you want to see it as such. We've got young men that are growing into identities of hyper-masculinity, which is quite a popular term at the moment, is toxic masculinity, and towards an element where toughness and dominance is a very, very appropriate tool towards growing up and towards psychosocial development. So it is not necessarily only a pro-social or an anti-social defense mechanism to deal with your environment and your experiences, and not becoming a victim, but maybe also dealing with being a witness, and normatizing and adopting, assimilating a set of behaviors, as well as perpetration actually being rewarding when it comes towards adolescence, towards having obtaining status and showing yourself, showing your dominance amongst your peer group, especially if the normative behavior of aggression is already quite on the physical conflict spectrum. So, and the question is then, how do we deal with this whole subculture or actual culture of violence when we have such normative behavior? And that's where we come to merge the elements of sports science from a martial arts perspective, sports for development, and psychology and social work a little bit. And we came up with some form of a theory of change where we say, okay, we would like to change the perception of violence and aggression in general to see as something that is omnipresent and very prevalent all over the world, but especially in the environment where a lot of the kids in Cape Town grow up. And we changed their relationship patterns amongst each other as to see this as something where you can acquire a certain skill under a certain maxim, under a certain philosophy, where you take the anarchistic, the chaotic, the power struggle element away from it and develop a set of rules that are governed by skills and by a sense of mastery with it. And in theory, we're going to come up with some sort of change from antisocial to pro-social behavior, even though with a very similar physical expression. And so then in this equation, we would like to actually work from the perspective of this as being a role model type of behavior towards a role model behavior that might actually have a pro-social channel. What we do with this in the sake of our NGO, just to give you a little bit of a framework, we have a specific intervention program that I'm going to use as the element of analysis for today and for this presentation. We also have a mentorship group because we see aggression and violence almost as a form of addiction in terms of developing a behavioral habitus and a certain coping with environmental stresses. Now, it's very often a reactive or proactive reaction to avoid victimhood or to maintain a certain dominance over other sets of people in your environment. Not necessarily from a racial perspective or class perspective, but just from a have or have not perspective, or experience this or not experience this perspective. In addition to this, we try to manifest this in community workshops and sports sponsorships. That trickles down a little bit, and there's a broader filter of who is actually be a possible recipient or beneficiary for this and who might not be. To look at the intervention and our school-based intervention, we are working with a minimum of 8 to 9 months, meaning 1 academic year, within often a school environment, because we see a lot of the schools as a microcosm of society, where every agent and institution of society is somewhat still merged together, especially towards the age of pre-adolescence and adolescence, where you might still be able to form or shape somebody or catch somebody before going completely into a livelihood and life of delinquency, which requires a much different set of resources when trying to change behavior in that sense. So what we do, we work with 2 sessions per week, 1 hour, happening in school time. The teachers, we're working in the school in a very, very hectic gang area called Mitchell's Plain, one of the highest prevalence of gang violence and murder in the whole country and in the whole continent when you take Africa as such. And the school we're working with is a school that doesn't lead towards graduation with a skill certificate, meaning you do not have any school leaving certificate, no formal education, it's just a skill. Very often it's kids that have cognitive disabilities or cognitive lower level of cognitive function, or of conduct problems, meaning that do not fit in the mainstream schools. So they're already the tougher ones when it comes to education in general. Number one. Number two, the teachers and the school counselors select the learners that they find most appropriate for behavioral intervention towards aggression and substance abuse behavior. And then we take usually 20 participants per group, 25 because usually then truancy is quite a high factor, so that we work with around about 20 people, and we usually have one, mostly two qualified and experienced martial arts trainers, because it works from a very nice role modeling perspective as well. It's something that kids rather aspire to and seeing than something more prevalent than having talking or the conservative methods of group therapy. So our aim is actually that we can channel emotions from an antisocial reactive formation towards a pro-social and skillful mastery-based orientation. So it's obviously quite a construct that might not be done within a short-term intervention. 6 to 12 weeks programs that are common in psychology and social work are, from our experience, an absolute misfit and a misuse of funds and misuse of allocations of resources. That's why we work with a long-term approach within an intercept of community and society that trickles down into a lot of different spheres. We're drawing our elements surely from martial arts as a practice, but also from psychoeducation, from cognitive behavior therapy, conflict resolution strategies that are very context-specific, from experiential learning and general motivational interviewing techniques that are quite popular in substance abuse treatments. Maybe a question towards you, because I find this usually interesting when dealing with people that have a martial arts background. What would come to mind in terms of the whole spectrum of martial arts as good frameworks, good types of martial arts for violence prevention? Systems, specific arts, context, philosophies. What would come to mind first?
Actually, I wouldn't really specify on one exact martial art, but rather different practices from different martial arts, because I think that different martial arts, or maybe that all martial arts have, let's say, positive and let's say negative practices that could, or I mean in context of this aim. So it's hard to pick just one martial art, I would say.
Somebody has a favorite?
Wrestling in common.
Okay, I hope this is not going to give it away. This is not going to give it away somewhat. In sport for development, the most popular martial art being taught in developmental context for behavior and whatever development one wants to focus on is boxing and karate. I think maybe also because of their popularity and the resources that are being allocated towards the use of it. We're using a little bit of a mixed methods approach in what we're teaching. And our main focus, however, is also conceptually within Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The gentle art, if you wish, in that way, because it's a sense of mastery and a skillfulness that requires lesser of an element of power and strength and more of skill development and being able to differentiate between attacking and defending. And you can teach this from the methodological standpoint, pedagogically. You can teach it towards the level, okay, I put you in a scenario where you are out of place and out of context, where you're already under attack, which is your status quo. And now find a solution. And we equip them with a skillful, orientated solution. But then step by step, based on maturity, we're mixing indeed different types of concepts. Besides the fact that I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the Jiu-Jitsu way and the Bushido concept is a very nice element of trying to provide a frame, which otherwise a gang is going to provide you. It's a similar type of identification with something that you feel as a risk-seeking adolescent very prone to, that you can identify with. So social identity towards a martial art or towards a gang, if it's an American, a 28, a 26, a 27, a hard living, it gives you a certain sense of identity, even in a different type of language, something you can find yourself within. And it gives you some sense of purpose and meaning, which is very reshaping, if you wish, as such. In terms of our methodology and how do we investigate this, we're running this already for 5 years in different settings, but we're working with a specific intervention school already for 4 years. The bigger picture is obviously that we try to investigate what are the actual effects, what changes and how does it change that martial arts specifically as a sporting and pedagogical tool can change such a behavioral manifestation such as proneness to violence and aggression as conflict resolution or reward seeking and gaining activities to just come with a certain goal. And as such, we try to capture 3 specific elements that we think are somewhat measurable from a scientific perspective, because aggression and violence from a psychological perspective and sociological perspective are very, very difficult to capture with simple research tools on the positivistic epistemology. So we focus on disruption and disruptive behavior as assessed by experts, in that sense the teachers that have a lot of contact with them. Aggression behavior as being displayed in terms of physical fighting, but also verbal aggression and conflict resolution when it comes to teasing or reacting towards certain provocations. And their pro-social behavior, which means how does behavior actually change, or does it just stop aggression and violence for a certain period of time up until another trigger, stress or whatever arises again. And so we use a mixed methods approach similar as to our martial arts methodology, in that we take learner feedback in form of semi-structured interviews, because a lot of quantitative tools I think do not capture their realities very well, number one. Number two, there's a lot of malingering when it comes to the use of answering things correctly. And thirdly, often the reflective and the cognitive capacities of verbalizing a feeling, verbalizing certain responses to behaviors is very challenging for a lot of the at-risk learners that we are dealing with. Then we're using a teacher evaluation that is a quantitative tool, the TOCA, which I'm going to explain to you a little bit in detail in the next slides. And then we have program facilitator feedback from every session, rating learner behavior in terms of the most 3 prevalent positive examples and the 3 negative examples, and why you would say this, and looking at different themes arising, what makes somebody function in the negative spectrum and in the positive spectrum, and if there's some sort of a repetition and a trait that is similar to the teacher evaluation. And then we're looking at official school records when it comes to truancy, substance abuse in terms of testing positive for drugs, or just fights that have been recorded in a school setting. For the qualitative tools, we have here an initial portfolio that we fill out and that we just keep track record on, similar to a social work or a psychological counseling file. Then for the group sessions and the evaluation of the coaches, which are, as I said, mostly 2, that means we're trying to match this also, trying to focus, okay, what was the technique, what was the pedagogical focus of the session, and what are the 3 most positively behaving participants and why. Very often we chose them because of pro-social activities or because of the lack of previously negative behavior. So that's usually quite an interesting tool when being evaluated. And then our quantitative tool is the TOCA, so the teacher observation of classroom adaptations. It's a 21-item tool that measures on the 3 sub-skills that we said, okay, are somewhat measurable and somewhat quantifiable for teachers. And we take this every school term. The school term, the academic year goes with the calendar year, so starts in January, ends in December. So that means we're taking it after the first term, after the second, after the third, after the fourth term. And it's a very simple tool because very often teachers, when having to do this for your 10, 15 learners that you often have a lot of struggles with, there is also a lack of proneness on filling out tools repetitively towards, okay, how do they behave? So that's another challenge that arises when data capturing on that matter. Some of the initial results, we worked on this, or we work in this cooperation with the University of Stellenbosch. And we looked specifically for that research tool that we can use on a longitudinal basis, because we want to think we take a 15-year-old learner and we can follow him in best case for the 4 years that he spends in the skills school. And what happens very seldomly in the sports for development sector, or generally in the how does a specific sporting tool changes behavior, it is very mood orientated. And so we try to, and we hope to, if we get the funding for it, to maintain this for a longitudinal aspect of 4 years and beyond through the mentorship group. And if we gain 4 years of this data, I can hopefully in the next couple of years present you a little bit of more detailed information in this. Something interesting that we started this year when using this tool, we have here displayed in red, the 2nd and 3rd year of intervention for the learners at the school already, meaning they started in 2018 or they started 2017 already with our intervention, but we haven't captured it with this tool, their behavior. We only use qualitative methods before 2019. And now we had the baseline and we compared them with the new first year of intervention learners. And you can see already that the starting baseline values are significantly different, especially when it comes to concentration. The lower the concentration score, the better. It's disruptive behavior, meaning the higher the score, the more disruptive, the lesser and worse your concentration is, as rated by the teachers. So you can see significant differences in terms of concentration and significant differences in terms of antisocial behavior. In terms of pro-social behavior, we could not yet find and test any differences when it comes to that. Even though the tendency is towards a more pro-social behavior of the kids that have already done the program in the second or in the third year. If we just compare the baseline of our intervention group in 2019, then we can see concentration is so far within 3 months, meaning 1 term. That's the data we have until today. It's very stable. There's a slight tendency towards improvement, but we think, based on the methodology I'm going to show you now pedagogically, is going to be rather a topic of the next few terms, to be outplaying a little bit more in the data here. And antisocial behavior, which is a very prevalent tool that we initially deal with, has started to decrease already significantly, which is obviously quite positive for us. Pro-social behavior has slightly changed, but yeah, again, no statistical difference here. If we're looking at this is what we have been capturing, how do we facilitate this change? So what's our methodology, our actual theory of change? We're working with a 4-phase model towards the year, working also similarly with one specific broader topic throughout the year, and we try to find themes in the qualitative analysis, meaning through thematic analysis, in a semi-structured interviews we compile at the end of every year. We try to match if those themes match. So it's some form of, we get feedback from the participants and we try to work it within our methodology. So this is already a process that goes for a couple of years. And we start to focus on psychosocial norms, on group norms and actual cohesion of these learners in the first term, which is already, this norming, storming, performing concept also works in such an intervention that the norming takes around about 3 months. And I think that is also quite good represented in the feedback that we get from a lot of participants. And for example, here showing when you do something wrong, they tell you, don't worry, just try it again. It's not a big effort if you make a mistake. So the qualitative feedback from our participants seems to reflect that this is something we are somewhat on par with. Similarly, here everyone has the same problem. They identify and they build some form of a cohesive environment with one another and see, oh, actually, just because we have been in a fight, actually you're dealing with similar problems at home, you're dealing with similar problems in your neighborhood than I do, and they start to see more similarities amongst each other rather than the differences. And the martial arts basis forces them, as you see here, obviously to work together with one another, which brings us to the second stage, which is the trust and self-esteem gaining to become a focus. We have more pro-social, understanding what it means to be pro-social. To be empathic means first to trust. And to gain this element of trust, you need to start to have a norm on how do you learn to trust this person, because the streets and your living environment does not offer you the opportunity to trust. Most likely also not in the family and in the home, if you look at interpersonal violence and gender-based violence. And there we try to shift a little bit towards an environment of trust. I can trust my training partner not to hurt me. And the tap, metaphorically, is a quite powerful tool in this. You would have killed me now. You would have broken something within me now, but I trust you not to do it. That's why I tap. And do not freak out. So it gives you a sense of calm, a sense of mastery as such, in defeat, but also in victory. And so our main focus then in here, and to show you some of the impressions, we work really from a grassroots level in that we work in a classroom that we set our dojo ourselves. The learners clean their mats, they learn to take ownership, they learn to respect the school environment and the property that's being provided to them. Obviously it gets ups and downs and whatsoever, nothing goes perfect as such, but they get offered the opportunity to take ownership for something that other people don't give them. And as you see here, this actually coincidentally, that this one reflects with our logo. However, I think it's quite nice metaphoric that the learners physically identify with this. And that brings us actually to our next intervention phase, the trigger identification. We're dealing with individuals, or we're dealing with a group of people and or a society that is not very well known for their verbal expression capacity. Not everybody verbalizes their emotions. A lot of people physically act on them. A lot of people reflect on them. There's dance therapy, there's art therapy, which is not necessarily a verbal reflection of our emotions, of our inner state, of our psyche. but we place a significant emphasis in the education and institutional framework on doing that. Whoever speaks best is the one that is being seen as more intelligent and being more dominant. But that's not the reality that a lot of our learners grow up in. And the physical strength, the dominance actually is a prevalent and a high aspiration to go towards. And we say, we give this a framework, you can express yourself. And very often trying to capture this physically, and that means with a picture that represents body and giving a tool that I can actually express myself differently, my anger differently than my fear. That allows you a big spectrum of behavior change. At least we think that this is a little bit of our Pandora box here, and why martial arts might be a better framework, a better coaching and educative pedagogical framework than a lot of other sporting activities. And so we essentially would like to obviously go from an element of fighting and expression of such to become a pro-social activity where I can do that to you, but I've got a sense of mastery with it, and I've got a broader philosophical sense, and say, I help you thereafter. I show you a different way, instead of just, let's see who's stronger. We all can see and compete. We can see who's stronger, who's more skillful, who's better. But then thereafter, we share something together that combines us, that makes us cohesive together. And I think a lot of what the kids have actually been saying reflected quite well. When you hit a person, that's martial arts. That's what you thought first. However, it's different. Skills to the fighting, you don't just hit. You have to be in danger to use martial arts. You need to have a knife against you or a gun against your head. Then you can't hurt him. Not hurt, which is like hurt him very hard, but more like get his weapon out of his hand. We don't teach any weapon defense. However, that's some expression that is obviously, fighting is not just an element of, okay, let's see who's physically stronger with a fist, but realities of knife fighting and gun fighting are very different in that setting. Or participant number 9, before I actually just thought martial arts is like normal fighting, you just go to someone and you beat them up. And that's where the trigger identification happens. And in our 4th phase, we try to bring this towards an emotional stabilization where the sportsmanship and going into the sports can help, or where you just say, I learned something for myself, I go on with my life. I go on with the skill that I've learned emotionally for myself and a slightly different coping skill. Just seeing the world and experiencing the world slightly different. Through empathy, through trust. And so the reflection is also now, it's not about strong, it's about the mindset. It's a setting that you're setting for, I know how to do this, so I won't do it. I won't hurt the person unnecessarily if I do not have to. To control myself and to know what is wrong and what is right. So that is supposed to be a behavioral manifestation, and it takes quite a while. In our experience, it takes at least 9 months, and a manifestation with a lot of the learners we're working for 3 to 4 years that are starting to work as coaches now and going to conferences in South Africa with a lot of academics, professor, doctors, not having a grade 9 leaving certificate and saying, I don't understand what you say, and you're doing a lot of research in my community, but my life is not as you describe it. I don't think that is the truth. And we so we're quite proud of this, that we think we find some sort of an edge where we can provide a few opportunities to bring research and knowledge together with actual lived realities. Because that's why I think the nonprofit sector should put a high emphasis on in terms of just providing knowledge. What helps us with this as a main guiding principle is the 753 honor code, where we also teach the kids, okay, there are certain virtues that comes towards your life, a philosophy that often fills a gap in this anarchy that a lot of them grow up in. Together with keys and behaviors towards a healthy spirit, because that's what everybody, this is something they can identify with, because that's what they see themselves very often as already. Plus some money, plus some cocaine, plus some bitches, as they would probably phrase it. However, this can change. And this can change when we think of the different states of mind, when we bring this into a little bit of a broader philosophy and towards a personality that they might strive towards. So there's quite a few more things that come in theory. Something that I just want to show in terms of a couple of impressions, where when manifesting this in your community, now you have some of the kids that used to be the guys that are trying to steal your money, try to stab you, or have done that already, and then become your coaches. You have the capacity to slip in a different role without having to succeed in what society terms as the normal institutions and normal forms of doing such, but just by aspiring towards a certain skill and using it, martial arts as a pedagogical platform, which I think is a context of this conference. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I suppose there's a lot of questions in that. Yeah, firstly, thank you for your great talk. I think your project is very, very nice and very important, I think. But my question would be, what exact martial practices you mostly use in training?
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like what exact techniques, or maybe not techniques, but yeah.
Initially, we teach a lot of the basic self-defense aspects of Jiu-Jitsu and of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu becomes more popular and becomes also something they have heard of already or have seen somewhat. Mixed martial arts is quite popular in South Africa. They have a big organization there and they think, okay, this is the idea of real sports fighting. And we take an element of this that they, okay, I have seen that already. And we pick them up where they stand and we put them in situations being in a headlock. What are the most common situations that you find yourselves in, being in a headlock, being grabbed from behind, being bullied myself, and then trying to say, okay, don't freak out. Here's a technique how you escape from there. And we move from the escaping techniques, trusting, the trust-building relationships that we focus in the first part, and then going towards the typical types of controlling. So it takes usually, depends on the group and depends on their maturity, 9 months towards the second year up until we teach them any attacking techniques. So it's usually, there's a scenario, I don't teach you how to get there, you know that somebody's going to put you there by surprise, this is how you can get out of it. And there's a set of techniques that goes similar to the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu way, towards blue belt, the typical self-defense aspect, then moving towards control in terms of a setting of, okay, this is the point style fighting of Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and on top of this, some punch defense, some self-defense aspects that are tangible. And then when maturity kicks in and when we see the group has the maturity for that or can move on, then we might actually spew in a couple of attacking techniques going towards the sporting direction. A lot of them after 1 year, okay, that's it, that's where it stops and starts, but then we would like to go on obviously now towards year 3 and 4 and so on.
So I think, so you don't put so much emphasis on like being technically very skillful, but it's more of, on the actual interaction between the individuals.
Yeah.
Right?
So we have very few, you saw our resources are very scarce, and trying to paint a picture to say, you know, we have champions. This gentleman here, for example, he won a South African championship. One of our coaches is currently a world champion in the EFC. Whoever is in the MMA scene, that's the biggest MMA organization in Africa, streaming on the zone. So he's one of our coaches. And so we have positive role models and the interaction with them to show you a different alternative, because your other role model might be the big gang boss in the area, because he's got everything you want or you think you want. And then to say, hey, there's a different way, that's the pedagogical tool that's more important to us. And to say martial arts, they think they do martial arts and they think they do sporting training, but it's an actual sense. Once they really, let's say, graduate behaviorally, then we offer them the opportunities to work with some of our partnering gyms. And then they get an invitation based on behavioral merit.
First, I'm really moved. Great thing you're doing, very impressive. I think also especially because all martial artists can relate to this because of the experience of martial arts. This is actually not a question, maybe a comment, I don't know, someone sharing. Having something to do with learning to fight, and fighting being antagonistic and mutual destruction, but learning to fight implying the necessity of cooperation and working together, and actually in hardship and going through high stress levels means intense social relationships with high levels of trust, and empathy as a necessary element of successful fighting has to be trained in order to anticipate your opponents. So there's a lot of elements of, I call it antagonistic cooperation, that by training to kill or destroy or whatever, the opponent forms strong social bond, pro-social bond. I think that's, even if it's actually just training to kill people, you need your partners to learn that, so you need them, and you are also sharing common goals with them. So every martial art has different degrees, this mixture of actual fighting components and restraint components or control components that reshape the antagonistic moment in a pro-social manner, which I think is a fantastic tool. I always thought so. I see now in your project, and I know other projects from problem parts of town in Bremen who I work with, where that seems to work too. But this is an extreme context, and I think it's very strong. To me, it's just very impressive. I think it's great. Thank you. Also, proof of concept.
Thanks.
Yeah. So maybe one more question. So you see I'm very interested in your work. My question would be, so I think you don't incorporate any kata training in any way. So my question would be, was this like an actual decision not to incorporate kata training, or is it more like it just happened because you have more Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coaches there, and you don't have this in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? So is it like a real decision not to incorporate this, or?
It's the lack of. We would have more coaches if you wouldn't do a grappling sport, because the striking sports are more popular at least in South Africa and in Cape Town. Challenge is the focus on self. They, as I said, now they come with different impulsivity reactions and have learned a different impulsivity to environment reaction. And kata is, I would say, self-control advancement that comes only at later stages. This other control, this interaction, this wildness, maintaining with another partner in cooperation is easier for them. We had our trials and errors where we also did some striking aspects from Muay Thai, because I like the philosophical backgrounds that stand behind it, the histories and stories you can just tell, where you say, oh, I identify with this type of attitude because of for example, the Zulu or the Xhosa in South Africa, they identify with this warrior mentality, where it's like, okay, there's a warrior mentality that you can also identify with, but it doesn't kill, it displays in the sporting sense. And what we found with the striking aspect, they like to show their friends. The grappling arts are very often too complicated to replicate those scenarios. We also have a confidentiality, what happens here stays here. However, they show their friends, they show their family. It's like, it's too technical, I can't explain this to you as a novice. Doesn't give you a sense of superiority, just like, okay, that's not a thing I can do with you. Striking, like you punch like this, you punch like that, and you cannot really direct towards when do you use a strike? Do you use it to enforce something for your own negative reward? Or do you use it really to defend yourself? And where a kata would come in, for example. A grappling kata, grappling inquires some sort of an attack from the other opponent, and they interplay in the scenario. Where you say conflict, now it helps better with the direct conflict resolution. Focus on self comes on later stages, where we bring the striking within. So we had those experiences in there where like, okay, now they're starting to stand in the squat now of Mshulov, and then they're starting doing this, and everybody looks at them, tries to antagonize this, and they want to show off their skill because they're proud of it, but it attracts different type of attention.
I was thinking about maybe incorporating grappling moves into a kata.
Yeah.
So, but
we have at the end of every year we have a school end function where they display their skills, and they actually try to stage a play with their partners. So they try to bring something in the context. Initially we wanted to do it like, okay, take a topic and express yourself, almost like in dance therapy where we say, okay, use martial arts as your dancing physical expression tool. But that didn't work as well as it might work here. Because fighting is everything, fighting substance abuse, fighting conflict, fighting gangs, fighting everything, and you can perfectly portray it. There's a gang coming towards me, out-muscling me, and I'm going to put them in a triangle or put them in an armbar because I use my whole body, my whole mind, and focus on one small aspect of it. It's a perfect metaphor of body and society, but that's something that I would get excited for than somebody else coming up with it.